Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Devastation, Resistance Breeds Revolution for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Digital Studios and published by Rush Entertainment and Groove Games in 2003 for PC, and it actually was ported to Linux a bit later on, although that port was not very well received at all. And although the game did have a pretty mixed reception, it tended more towards the positive side of things than the negative side. So let's actually go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here, because it actually has quite a few elements that are worth taking a look at. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. This does run on Unreal Engine 2, and it's a generally pretty solid representation of the Unreal Engine 2 in its relatively early days, although you do have some oddities here and there, particularly with regards to the physics simulation being rather wonky across the board. And there are some odd bits and pieces here and there, like the hands, for example, being gigantic compared to the rest of the characters, particularly in the case of the female characters. And you end up with some odd artistic choices here and there, like the main character bearing more than a passing resemblance to Eminem. Aside from that, they are going for a sort of dystopian future look, and that means you do have some sci-fi elements, but the vast majority of it is going to be a bunch of dilapidated ruins, and that ends up being a whole lot of browns and grays and not a whole lot else. This means that while the visual quality is certainly solid for its time, it doesn't really have an appealing art style, and it ends up being very bland very quickly. And of course, even though the visuals were up to par when this was released, these days they look extremely dated, particularly with things like the lip syncing, which is literally just their mouth moving in the same exact pattern no matter what they're saying. But then you move past the visuals and you get into the sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier, because you have sound effects that are reasonable but definitely not impressive, particularly with regards to several of the gun sounds being pretty much just stock sounds that are slapped into this game. And it just leaves you feeling like most of your weapons are pretty low impact as a result. Then you move past the sound effects, and you have a soundtrack that is a bunch of electronic stuff that is decent enough music, but it doesn't really seem to fit in very well with what's actually going on in the game. It's just not really high impact enough, and you end up with tracks that don't really get you pumped up for anything. But then there's the absolute worst offender, the voice acting. It is just awful in this game. But the worst part is, it's not the funny kind of bad, it's just bad. And most of the voice acting either ends up sounding completely disinterested in what's going on, or they're putting on really strange accents that make absolutely no sense, or they're just completely butchering their lines no matter what they say. It just ends up being pretty obnoxious. And it's worth noting that that's when you compare it to its contemporaries, let alone with more modern games where they've ironed out the voice acting problems a lot more. Back in the day, they certainly had some issues with more quality voice acting, but you did have some quality voice acting back then. But Devastation certainly doesn't have it, and the presentation as a whole just ends up being a very mixed bag. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that in the not too horribly distant future, megacorporations rule the world, in particular Gratheus Incorporated, which rules with an iron fist, sending out pacification squads to basically just kill anybody who gets in their way of world domination. In this grim dark future, you play as a guy named Flynn, who is both an Eminem cosplayer and the leader of a small band of resistance fighters who are trying to take down Gratheus Incorporated and stop them from hatching their ultimate scheme to deploy a bunch of cloning machines that will effectively render their army immortal by just cloning the soldiers as they keep dying, and thus they have an infinite supply of soldiers. Yeah, let's just be fair here. The story is both incredibly derivative of other dystopian sci-fi kind of works, but also incredibly stupid in and of itself. I mean, the cloning machines effectively rendering their armies immortal, especially considering that the Resistance gets their hands on that technology pretty early on in the game, and ends up utilizing it for their own purposes, which gets pretty stupid as well. So you just have a complete mess of a storyline that will probably give you a headache more often than not, just trying to figure out what the hell they were thinking. And to make matters worse, the game ends on a cliffhanger that leaves you sitting there scratching your head going, you guys were seriously expecting on continuing this story at some point? Because there's nothing worth continuing there. The story itself isn't interesting, and when you go over to the characters, none of them have any personality at all. Not only do they all talk in monotones or have really bizarre accentuation that leaves you scratching your head wondering what kind of language they thought they were speaking, but the only thing you can really use to differentiate most of them is just the way they dress and look in general, and that's not enough. And since the writing is so weak, you ultimately turn to the gameplay, which does get a bit interesting. The early stages of the game are a relatively standard first-person shooter of the time. Very linear, very simple progression. You go from point A to point B, you complete your objectives, and then you get to the end of the level, you go to the next level. All pretty standard stuff. And since this was the kind of transitionary period between what we know as modern first-person shooters and the more 90s style of first-person shooters, you don't have regenerating health. You only have health pickups that you can find scattered around the levels. And this kind of becomes a problem later on, but I'll get to that more in a moment. As is fitting for something that hails more from the old school of first-person shooters, you also have a very large arsenal of weapons available to you, and you can carry all of them at once. Some of them even have alternate fires as well as dual-wielding capabilities. So, for example, all of the pistols and all of the one-handed submachine guns can be dual-wielded, whereas things like, say, the assault rifle have a burst fire as an alternate fire, whereas the primary fire is full of automatic. This means two things. First, you have a good variety of weapons available to you, from the more conventional, like 45 auto pistols, to assault rifles, to shotguns, all the way up to more sci-fi stuff like laser rifles, and even some rather silly weapons like rats that you can remote control that will run around and then explode in enemies' faces. Needless to say, this game is not going to get a PETA endorsement. But anyway, you use this wide arsenal to absolutely demolish the enemy as you go from level to level, and you fight various Graytheus troops as well as their various robots, and you ultimately try to take down the mega corporation. But you're not doing it alone. You have a squad of resistance fighters to help you along the way, and you can command them around using a very simple interface which basically consists of hold position, follow the player, defend, or attack. And that's it. And you will be needing to make use of those squad commands as you continue through the game, particularly once you get later on and you start to run into harder and harder scenarios, and you need to order your NPC allies around a lot more, and you need to micromanage them a lot more. You can either order all of your squad mates around all at once, or individually as well. This allows you to, for example, if you need to defend a position, but you also need to have somebody on offense, then you can order one or two specific allies to stay behind and defend the position, and then you can order the other ones to attack. This isn't going to be something you're going to be doing a whole lot of at the beginning of the game, but once you get towards the more middle and end parts, when you've unlocked the cloning technology, that's when you start to run into more of that sort of thing, because it basically turns into offline multiplayer matches as far as the actual gameplay goes. Because once you have the cloning tech, you actually respawn at the cloning pad immediately after dying, as opposed to having to reload a save. And as long as the cloning facility isn't destroyed, then you can just respawn indefinitely, and it effectively becomes a battle of attrition. If you just keep throwing yourself and your allies at the enemy over and over and over again, eventually you're going to manage to break through their defenses and get to the objective that you're trying to get to, which basically turns it into offline multiplayer and actually makes it rather tedious to play. Because once that tech shows up, then you basically have no consequence for dying anymore, because you're just going to keep infinitely respawning, and you're going to respawn with ammunition, so you might as well just keep doing it. And unfortunately, this design just goes to prove that the developers didn't really know how to implement it properly in their game and balance the difficulty around it, because once you get further on into the game, the enemies start to get tougher and tougher, and of course they start getting more powerful weapons that will end up one-shotting you in some cases, so it just becomes a matter of spawn, die, spawn, die, spawn, die over and over and over again, until eventually you manage through sheer trial and error to just complete the objective. But the thing is, if that were the game's only major issue, then that would just make it tedious, but there's a lot more going on than simply the level design being problematic thanks to the cloning technology and the respawn as a result. But the game suffers from a few other serious problems. One of them being a direct result of the cloning vats is the reduced amount of health items available after the cloning technology is introduced. Because it's basically like, oh, if you're just going to respawn, then why would we bother giving you health items? But other issues are present from the very beginning. For example, the physics system is fairly glitchy, and it does tend to prove problematic, particularly with regards to navigating environments when stuff just constantly gets in your way. Not to mention moments like this, where the enemy will just suddenly pop up into the sky and then they'll just land like it was nothing, and it just ends up being baffling. But you can generally work around glitchy physics. What you can't work around is the absolutely terrible AI in this game. whether it be for friendly characters or enemy characters. Both are incredibly stupid. You will lose count in the first few minutes of the number of times they will get stuck on things in the environment and not be able to progress, the amount of times that they'll start shooting at walls because there's an enemy behind that wall and they can detect that enemy, but they aren't smart enough to go around the wall and shoot at them that way. Or even situations where they will see an enemy, whether it be an enemy unit or a friendly one, and they will not actually attack it because for some reason they haven't been aggroed by it. It's just a really bizarre experience to watch your friendly AIs walk right past an enemy, and that enemy will not attack them, and they won't attack that enemy, and even moments where you will walk past an enemy, and they will not attack you because for some reason their aggro wasn't triggered. Of course, moments of the latter are considerably fewer than moments of the former, but they do occasionally happen. And in fact, the AI becomes one of the biggest problems in the game, because certain moments require some fairly precise tactics, and the AI is simply not capable of handling that. In fact, there's one particular section pretty early on in the game where you have to disable a laser fence, but the area to do it in is so narrow that none of your AI teammates can be in front of you while you're doing it, so you mostly just get mowed down by enemy troops while you're sitting there holding the button down because you can't do anything else while you're disarming the laser fence, and it takes several seconds to do it. So you're basically a sitting duck for the enemy to just sit there and be like, oh look, the guy's trying to disarm the laser fence, let's just mow him down with massive amounts of machine gun fire. No matter how much I tried, I could never figure out a way to beat that segment legitimately, so I just turned on God mode, disarmed the laser fence, turned off God mode, and continued on my merry way. And it's things like that, when you're constantly forced to micromanage your squad mates because they're too dumb to act on their own, or they're too dumb to actually follow your orders correctly, and you end up getting constantly annihilated for it, it just makes the game an incredibly frustrating experience. And it's an instance where the wonky physics system, the fairly poor level design, and the extremely poor AI all play into each other, just make it a pretty awful game as a whole. That's not to say that the game couldn't have been a success, it's just that the interesting ideas that it tries to throw in there just don't work out in the long run, and the technical mastery of the engine and of the physics system, and especially of the AI, is simply not at an acceptable level, and as a result, it gets a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.